Welcome back to the set of the Talk of Paris. Our new guest is Bob Geldof, a singer and also a friend of Bono. They have together created the organization Data to fight against hunger and poverty in Africa. Bob Geldof, a musician who is still giving concerts around Europe and who is also an entrepreneur. He owns some television stations, some magazine. Bob Geldof, bonjour.
Bonjour.
So my first question today is, what is at stake a few weeks before the G8 in Japan? Do you consider the world is not keeping its promises to help Africa at this time where there is a huge raise of the prices of food around the world and especially in Africa? Is this your priority today, to try to remind us that we have to do something?
I think it's a question of credibility. In 2005, the wealthiest economies promised to double aid to Africa by the year 2010 to a sum of $50 billion. Remember that Europe, the wealthiest continent in the planet, is 12 kilometers from the poorest continent in the planet. And each year Europe receives more aid. Europe, the wealthiest continent, receives more aid than Africa, the poorest continent. 50 billion is a small sum. The G8, the leaders of the wealthiest economies, have so far delivered 14% only of their promise. Now, we're all very skeptical about political promises. In fact, there's a great disconnection, I think, between populations now and the political class, not just throughout Europe, but nationally as well. The same is happening in the G8. But to break your promise from the most powerful to the weak is the worst possible thing to do. If I'm a parent and I say to my kids, I'll take you to the movies on Saturday, and when Saturday comes, we'll do it next week, you can see cynicism begin to come into a child's eyes. If I'm a businessman and I break my contract with you, you'll sue me, I'll go to court. Why do politicians think that they can betray the poor in our name? You don't sign the name Jacques Chirac. You don't sign the name of your party. You don't even sign the name of your government. You sign the name of the French people. So, you know, I don't understand this about political leaders. Why do they find it so easy to lie, to break their promise, especially to the poor? And I will be in Tokyo again, and I will be urging them to complete their promise. It's an important year for France. You take over the EU presidency. You're looking at your budget for the next 3 years. So there's a moment here for President Sarkozy to take world leadership. And because the world is suffering an economic crisis, put it in context. China and India are investing billions of dollars in Africa. The United States private sector is investing billions of dollars in Africa. Their political influence is huge as a result. Where's Europe? What are we doing? You know, our rhetoric is the rhetoric of the middle of the 20th century. We don't seem to be able to negotiate with this continent, our close neighbour. Forever we will be joined to Africa. French people are worried about immigration. They're worried about globalization. It's happening in Africa. If you want to prevent immigration, build up a society, build a state, and people don't want to move. If you want to invest in 900 million producers and consumers like China, India, and America is doing, go to Africa. We're not doing that.
But Europeans have given a lot of money over the past decades and can't help noticing that Africa is as poor as always. What do you say when people ask you where all that aid has gone? Where did all the money from Live Aid go? Can you say it was used properly and sensibly? Did it get lost? Did it get pilfered? What can you say to reassure people in the face of these realities?
The aid is very effective. Aid really works, despite the skeptics. One of the great triumphs of France, indeed, is the invention of the Global Fund for AIDS. Now, this is an empirical structure. I can take €1 from a French citizen and show you the trail from France right down to a person getting AIDS drugs for the first time. In 2002, only 50,000 people in Africa were getting AIDS drugs, and they had to pay for them. This year, it's stabilised, and 2 million receive AIDS drug every year, and we can exactly see the money trail and the result. With education, the same thing. There is the Fast Track Education Initiative, it's called. You can trace each dollar, euro, pound, yen from its source down to a schoolroom in Africa. And as a result of 1 million French people signing a petition, amongst others in the world, in the year 2000, because of Live 8 in Paris, where 500,000 children were on the street, 29 million children in Africa have gone to school because of debt cancellation. 29 million. That's half the population of France.
Sure, but other figures show that several tens of billions of aid have evaporated or ended up in the African dictators' pockets. Do you have a way of keeping track of what African governments do with that money?
During the Cold War, you're absolutely right. We spent our money as aid to our pet tyrants. We supported Mobutu, for example, in Zaire, and the Soviets supported Mengistu in Ethiopia, because we couldn't fight the Cold War. It was too expensive for us to fight. We'd lose too much. The Soviets couldn't fight it because they had no money. So we had the hot war in the South, in Latin America, South America, and in Africa, and we paid for our, as I say, our favoured tyrants. As soon as the Cold War was over in 1989, suddenly we got rid of Mobutu, the Soviets got rid of Mengistu, and we could now talk politically and economically. Before then, we could only really deal with charity. Now we can deal with the underlying structure of poverty, which is politics and economics. Now there's a new compact, but still the G8 talk in the old terms of the Cold War.
We periodically hear talk about Africa rising from its slumber and about the emerging middle class that might lead Africa to a brighter future. Do you think things are actually happening in Africa, that our negative image of it is overshadowing the fact that things are actually changing?
Yes, I mean, in sub-Saharan Africa, 23 more or less democratic states. The continent is growing 6.2% annually. I mean, compare that to European growth. It's from a very low base. But if the extractive countries where there's oil and cobalt and zinc and platinum, everything, of course, they're increasing hugely. But even in the landlocked countries, even where there's no extractive industries, there's growth of 5%, possibly a little more. In the more democratic countries, you see 10 to 12% growth. And you're seeing the basic beginning of a middle class and civic structures. You're also seeing the amount of investment from China needing the resources of Africa, and the private sector from America meeting this. Now there's a danger, because with Chinese mercantilism, you get an American response that is essentially militaristic. But again, what's Europe's position? We had a tragic European Union, African Union summit in Lisbon. It was ridiculous. The Chinese now have a game to play. They can go to the Chinese, they can go to the Americans. When they come to the Europeans, we lecture them. We need to be engaged with Africa because all our resources, our energy will come from Africa. We need to engage with Africa because our export market will be Africa. As investment comes into the continent, as it is doing for the first time in centuries, the economy will grow. And I'm telling you this, I know people will laugh and think it's ridiculous. Africa will be an economic giant by 2040 because it has to be. Because it has to be. China will be overdeveloped, India will be very developed. There'll be only one place you can come to which still has the resources, but also the capacity for growth.
I have two questions about China. We've heard that China is in Africa to siphon its natural resources dry. Is there a chance it will end up pillaging Africa?
A good question. Because of communications and media, in the 19th century, we all pillaged Africa. The French, the English, the Germans, we did that. We don't want to see a repeat of that. But I think in the first instance, the Chinese just came with the checkbook and said, how much do you want for the platinum? How much do you want for the zinc? They then, I think, slowly learned, but more rapidly, that if they engage in normal international business standards, then they get better advantage. They didn't come with the political agenda, they don't want to be involved, but because of the massive investment of their monies, they are involved, they are engaged politically. So I'll give you an example. In Zambia, they refused to recognize the unions, and so the workers went on strike. The opposition parties made a political noise. 2 guards were shot. Within 2 weeks, there was international uproar. Within 2 weeks, the Chinese had recognized the unions, and now production continues. So I think, and this is true of China in general around the world, they understand and they're learning very quickly that to engage multilaterally is better than just pretending that they're isolated and on their own. I don't think that a repeat of colonialism can happen. I don't think so. I hope not.
My other question about China is whether you personally think it's a good idea to boycott the Olympic Games, or at least the opening ceremony in Beijing in a few weeks' time, to defend the Tibetan cause, or does it make more sense to be in Beijing to talk to Chinese and Tibetan authorities?
I'm not big on gesture politics. You know, I do rock and roll, you know, has a function in articulating and making gestures politically. Chinese behavior in Tibet is ridiculous. It's unbecoming to a power of the size of China. There's no need for it. Were I a leader, I don't think I'd attend the opening. But, I mean, it seems silly, doesn't it? I mean, this gesture. But I would definitely negotiate with the Chinese. I would always talk with them. I would always try and do business with them. And I would make it clear that I believe in these things. My electorate believes in this. But we can talk about this.
Getting back to Europe and the French EU presidency, Sarkozy, how do you feel about Ireland's referendum? Was it a catastrophe for Europe, or was it just a reflection of the Irish people's legitimate concern over what Europe might have in store for them? What's your position on Sarkozy and the referendum?
I think it's a catastrophe if the leaders just ignore it and pretend nothing's happened. It's not just Ireland. The French voted no to the exact same structure. Exact same. There's no change. They just changed the name from treaty, from constitution to treaty. The Dutch voted no. And the Irish were the only people allowed to vote. We don't know what would happen if the other 26 were allowed to vote, but a good proportion of people would say no, not to any national agenda, but because there is a belief that there is this democratic deficit, that Europe is a project of the political class, that there's a disconnection between what happens in Brussels and what people in Paris feel, what people in Dublin feel. And now they don't want to be told in impenetrable language what to do, say or think. And when the political class of Ireland, all the parties, all the churches, all the unions say vote yes, being Irish, you always say no. You know, and so for the elite to say, fine, we respect that, but it will make no difference, is a catastrophic mistake. Elements of the agenda, a president, no problem. So why don't we take an online vote on a president? A foreign minister, no problem. I think it's a good idea to have a unified, if it's possible for unified policy, why don't we vote on that? But structures that limit our Parliament's ability to change laws emanating from Brussels is a problem. Sarkozy has the mandate to address this in a coherent intellectual way. The people of Europe are not stupid. They clearly see the benefits of this thing. They just want to advance it in a way that gives them the voice that they fought for so long.
So there are high expectations about the French presidency beyond Ireland and indeed across Europe.
Yeah, but you know, I'm not trying to bring the conversation back to this data report that Bono and I are announcing. But here is a promise, a solemn promise of very little money to the poorest people in the world, that in 5 years we will go to help them to a certain amount. And the politicians are saying, okay, we'll do 14% of our promise. Of course there's a skepticism. You know, this is a great political project. It's worth thinking about. It's worth addressing the people of Europe and bringing them with us on the way. For Sarkozy, it's a fantastic opportunity to go to the heads of state meeting in Europe, to go to the G8, to address the position of Africa, to deal with the Mediterranean Union concept. It's a great moment for France to take leadership now. Stop being afraid of globalization, stop being afraid of these issues. The world is going through an economic moment. But we are, remember this, we are the most successful continent ever seen. We're the healthiest and we're the wealthiest. We don't feel it, but it's true. And we should now take a leadership role. And it's up to France, really, to lead us.
Thank you very much, Bob Geldof, for being here with us for this talk of Paris, a few weeks before the G8 and French presidency of the EU.
Merci.
And I will see you next week for a new edition of the Talk of Paris. See you soon.